Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I am your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today, we are here with Andrés Spokoiny, the CEO and president of the Jewish Funders Network. Andrés, welcome.
Thank you. Nice pleasure being here.
And I don't even think I butchered your last name too badly, as we were
You
talking about
did
before.
you did great. Very,
So
very
I
good.
want to talk about Jews and power. We can start with sort of the big overarching question and then narrow in. There's this big question that I think has circulated around the Jewish world, obviously since Zionism, but arguably even before that, which, I'll just try to summarize the historic terrain and then you can talk about your article and some of the ideas behind it. It's no surprise to anybody who listens to this podcast that Jews went about 2,100 years without any political autonomy, right? We went from the Hashmonai dynasty sometime in the BCs all the way to 1948 with Zionism. And so Jews have survived without really any overt political or military power for, again, roughly 2 millennia. And whereas most Jews saw this as just sort of an accident of history, and obviously if it can be reversed and Jews can reacquire political power and autonomy and a military and perhaps even a state, even though obviously the advent of nation states did not exist in, say, the year 800 in Spain. Other Jews actually took this as a philosophic or theological mantra of powerlessness is actually something to be applauded and relished in, which is one of the reasons why I really loved your article, because you really trace this. And so let's just start with, some of the overview. What inspired you to write that article, and then we can sort of get into the terrain, and we can talk about this question of, Jews, power, and all of this, because the other one other thing that I want to say that sort of has dawned on me is it seems like it's only the last generation or so that views power as ipso facto bad, especially if you're in
Yeah,
progressive circles, right? For most of
right,
history, power was something that people wanted. And now
right.
all of a sudden in the 21st century, maybe arguably in the 20th century, as Jews start to acquire power, people start to view power with increased skepticism, which, just sort of, I don't know, my heightened, anti-Semitism senses are tingling of, well, power's okay for everybody except for Jews. And so
Except
that's
the
a little
Jews.
bit of the
Right.
way that I read it. But anyway, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. And I have to tell you, Daniel, is amazing to have these type of conversations because I love when, like, I don't think in the Jewish community we have enough of these intellectual conversations or conversations about ideas, right? So I welcome this opportunity, and I think it's courageous of you to put out a conversation that is about ideas. It's not about like the news of the day, but goes what's happening underneath. I think that, listen, what motivated me to write that article, and if you want, we can summarize the main argument. The main argument is that there's a current in anti-Zionist thinking that says that, as you were saying, that Jews having power is bad for the Jews and is bad for the world because the uniqueness of the Jewish people, so they claim, was that they were a people without power, and by being a people without power, they could develop a unique ethical and humanistic approach that you can't have when you have power. So that's the general argument. I'm oversimplifying. We can go deeper into that argument later on, but just to say, and I'm saying that I'm taking sides. I think that reasoning is bonkers. I mean, I understand the logic of it, but it's insane, and I gotta say why. But what really motivated me to write the article was this notion, this part of the debate I'm having with anti-Zionist Jews. I mean, it's important to say that anti-Zionist Jews are a fringe, right? Like 90 or something percent of the Jewish people would define themselves as Zionists and as Zionists in some shape or form. But there is a very vocal anti-Zionist fringe. And I think that the problem, I mean, yes, there's the people that are like really what we call treasonous. They really have issues and they want to hurt their own, and fine, it's like we can put that aside. But you see that some people have really, their anti-Zionism comes from a very deep philosophical uneasiness with power. In other words, they are afraid that Zionism destroys their own moral superiority, right? So you have a guy like, I don't know, Peter Beinart or somebody like that who's obsessed with how Jews use power, and he misses the times where we didn't have power, and therefore we couldn't do any harm. We couldn't do anything bad because we didn't have power. Now, I don't think these people are bad or evil or want to destroy the Jewish people. I think they have a wrong understanding of Jewish relation to power, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So maybe in a second, I'll actually play devil's advocate. It's not a position that I agree with, but maybe I'll take the devil's advocate position just because I think that can be a little bit more fun. Before I get there, one interesting thing that dawns on me is the people that make this about nationalism, which is sort of everybody, say, in the last 200 years, that's on the Jews shouldn't have power side. Theirs is a very, narrow, and geographically fragmented part of the Jewish community, mostly Western Europe and then obviously America, of Jews, starting with, say, Moses Mendelssohn in the 18th century, that were explicitly trying to make the argument to the mainstream, starting off German, but then arguably, other Western nation states, saying Jews actually have no political or national aspirations. Jews are just a religion. Don't worry. We're not going to really, meddle in the wider powers. Just let us sort of have our own, synagogues and prayers and everything like that. And so that there sort of has been a 200 or 300 year legacy just for, social and real politic of it, aside from getting into the theological
Yeah,
background.
I mean, I thought let me interrupt for a second. I think it's not. I think people got enamored with. I mean, Jews got enamored with an image they had of themselves as the moral conscience of humanity, right? Like we are the canary in the coal mine. We are the ones who are outside society because we don't have political power, because we're not a nation, because we don't have a state. So we are outside of society. And being outside of society gives us a very keen moral reasoning. We're much moral than others because we don't have to exercise power, that power corrupts. And secondly, by being outside of society, outside of the power structure of society, we are um, we are we can discover stuff. We can discover things in society that others can't. And that's why they say you have this Jewish genius like Kafka and Freud and Einstein, because they're outsiders, because they don't function in the power structure of the different nations, which so that was, I think, the argument. Jews got enamored with that view of themselves as the powerless people that serves as the moral beacon of the world, right? More than convenience, because yeah, there was an element there of apologetics, right? Of saying, oh, look at us, we're so good, we're so powerless, we're so, there was also that. But I think it's a sort of historical Stockholm syndrome, when you start loving your own oppression at some point.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, even doubling down on maybe not quite the idea of loving your own oppression, but trying to explain away oppression, which I think is
Right.
connected to this. There's sort of two parts of Jewish history that, you're obviously familiar with, just to spell it out for listeners in case they're not familiar. I mean, the two most destructive events in Jewish history before, obviously, the 20th century were destruction of the Second Temple and the expulsion and subsequent Spanish Inquisition. And right after both of those, almost like clockwork, right? You have the rabbinic answer to why the temple was destroyed, because of course you have others. And I always tell this to students, the second or third century CE was such a tumultuous time, and you had people within the Jewish community. Again, this is before Christianity really split off from Judaism. And so you had many in the Jewish community saying, maybe Jews are quote unquote no longer the chosen people, or God's changed God's mind, or the Mosaic code is no longer binding. And so the rabbis really had to contend with this. How are the people that
Right.
are quote unquote, again, God's chosen people? We don't have to deep dive into that, controversial statement, but, they obviously saw themselves as chosen for some unique mission. How did something as terrible as the destruction of the temple, and I'll add, the failed Bar Kokhba revolt against the Roman Empire, where hundreds of thousands were killed. How did that happen? So of course they look inwardly, right? It's because of our sins. It's because maybe we hated each other. It's because maybe we didn't respect the land well enough, right? Rabbinic literature, Midrash, and Talmud is sort of full of those statements. The second, it sort of doubles down on this even more, where Spain between the year 800 and arguably 12 or 1300, best place to be a Jew, relatively multicultural, although, historians have complicated that picture a little bit. But, people like Judah Halevi and Moses Maimonides and Nachmanides and Moses de Leon, right? All these, big heavy hitters of medieval Jewish thought, they're all in Spain. And suddenly the Jewish community gets kicked out in the 14 and 1500s. And all of a sudden you have these new philosophies that develop under the guise of, what's called Lurianic Kabbalah, of saying, yes, it seems like Jews have been the punching bag around the world. And from a literal reading of history, Jews have been the punching bag. How can that be if Jews have some special mission? It must be that there's actually positive value in the exile. And as Luria sums it up, God and the world is broken because, I've talked a lot about Lurianic Kabbalah on the podcast before, so we don't have to get into that. But it's specifically the spreading outness of the Jews and the fact that Jews aren't all centered in the land of Israel. And then, one might add with political power that there is this unique mission. So, there is some comfort in that idea, right? Like when I hear that idea, I don't immediately think, naive progressive sitting there,
No. There's some comfort, and it has, I mean, yes, we say it's something of the last 200 years, but it has a long pedigree. Like when you talk about the Talmud and the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Talmud is very, very afraid of Jewish power, but it is because of the historical circumstances. So the Mishnah starts to be compiled right after the failure of the Bar Kokhba revolt. The Bar Kokhba revolt was cataclysmic, even more so than the destruction of the temple. And you know that as somebody that teaches Jewish history, the Bar Kokhba revolt basically ended Jewish sovereignty, and it was like something like 500,000 dead, which is incredible for the land of Israel of the time, etc. So the Talmud says, and basically almost destroyed the Jewish people. Like that's the thing. So the Talmud says, we've tried to revolt against the Romans twice. We sought, sovereign power twice. In the big revolt of the year 74 and in the Bar Kokhba revolt of the year 135, and it caused disaster. We obviously can't fight the Romans. Let's make it taboo for the Jews to seek power, right? So especially military power, right? So for example, you would have a situation where the Talmud literally trashes Bar Kokhba. They call it Bar Koziva. Bar Kokhba means the son of the star. Bar Koziva means the son of a lie. And Hanukkah, for example, very interesting. Like all that business of the miracle of the candles or whatever is an attempt at misdirection. Like, in other words, the Talmud doesn't want that you talk too much about the military prowess of the Jews, because this is going to give the Jews idea for another failed rebellion. So let's make it all about the little candles and the oil. And let's face it, that's not a very impressive miracle. Among the miracles that God can work, to make oil last for longer. Okay, fine.
There's actually, I don't know if you've heard this, but there's a comedian, Ari Shafir, who has this whole stand-up bit about Judaism, and he talks about growing up, in the Orthodox community, and he's talking with his Christian friends around, Christmas, Hanukkah time, and he's sort of asking, oh, what's the miracle of Christmas? And they're talking about, how Jesus is, goes to dead and rising, and like, oh, what's your miracle? Like, well, this oil. They thought it was only going to last. It's a great bit, but yeah, no, it is a fascinating.
So the Talmud has a problem with Jewish. It doesn't have a problem with Jewish power. It simply recognizes that in these particular circumstances in which the Talmud was written, it was a matter of survival for the Jews, not to rebel against the Romans again. As you say, look inward. Create, George Steiner says, our homeland became the text, right? So let's say that our nation, our country is going to be Torah, and that's where we're going to live, right? So let's stop looking for power, because that, and let's also assume that we're being punished, I mean, we've been exiled because we're punished. So let's take our punishment and let's try to live as much as best as we can within the confines that our punishment are. No, that but the Talmud never made that into a good thing, right? It was a punishment, right? Now, in the 19th century and in the 20th century, this is what you're describing, that Jews started to look at that as it was good, like, oh, like Franz Rosenzweig has this thing about Jews as a people outside of history, like sort of were these timeless people, were not constrained by the same laws of power that other people. And it was a very intellectually appealing notion, right? And who doesn't want to be the moral beacon of the world? The truth is that there's nothing special about us. It was just that the lack of power puts us in a very vulnerable position, and it's very easy to be a humanist when you're vulnerable. It's very easy to be a pacifist when you don't have an army, when you can't have an army, right? So
Yeah.
so so the real challenge, the idea that powerlessness was good, of course, it was tricky to start with, but it got completely taken down in the pogroms of the late 19th century. All these Jews that believed in, enlightenment and whatever, they realized that in the very enlightened 19th century and 20th century, they still were being pogroms. That maybe powerlessness is not such a great thing. And it got completely buried in the Shoah. Like we know that powerlessness is not anymore an intellectual exercise. Powerlessness means being exterminated. So that vision was completely discredited. This idea that Jews shouldn't have power because that's good in the Shoah was completely discredited.
Yeah, 100%. And that's why, before when I was talking about sort of the, Brooklyn progressive who's sitting there,
Right, right,
by the
right.
way, in the comforts of America, which, if we're going to critique power,
Exactly.
we should probably, not that I'm against American power, but, to be here, I'm forgetting who, this is, many historians point out the Jews who made it to America were the lucky ones. Jews were
Right,
coming
right.
to America. I mean, you talked about this period in the late 1800s, early 1900s in Eastern Europe, which is, the vast majority of American Jews are, descended from at least a couple people who came through New York, Ellis Island in that period. Almost everybody came to America. It wasn't until
Correct.
America closes its borders in the 1920s that Zionism begins to, Zionism obviously predates that, but that Zionism starts to really take off in the global Jewish community. And so yes, the point is taken. I do want to double click on something you said, and again, it's not really my pushback because I totally agree with you, but it's one of the reasons why I actually do think you get significant pushback, not just in the humanistic Jewish community, but also in, say, a very traditional Orthodox community, where you sort of flippantly said, there's nothing unique or special about the Jewish people. And so that, for a traditionalist, and I think this explains a lot of the psychology behind the ultra-Orthodox opposition to Zionism, is they're not on the humanist side of sort of the Jews have to be spread out throughout, cafes in Berlin and Paris so they can, teach everybody about, I don't know, the joys of socialism, which of course is, more what Rosenzweig was arguing, not that straight up. But this wider idea that no, the Jews actually don't play by the normative rules of history, right? We have,
Yes.
God on our side. There are miracles.
Correct.
There is a messianic age at the end. And that Zionism is, in some very real sense, a breach of that contract of re-entering the Jews into history. And that's another way of saying taking the Jews out of the realm of religion and tradition. Now, this is, of
Correct.
course, exactly what early Zionists, they were saying, yes,
Sought to do.
we've
Zionism tried to do precisely that, to sort of secularize the messianic dream and say, we're not going to wait for God to redeem us. We're going to just bring up, we're going to re-enter history in a way. Like you phrase it very nicely. Like it's the Jewish people was both for the ultra-Orthodox and for the liberal intellectual were people outside of history. For the Orthodox, it was because we operate by other rules, by divine rules. The other people are guided by the rules of history, empires rise and fall, armies, economies. Jews are guided by the what God wants and God's plan for us and our own ethical and moral behavior. That's the Orthodox world that Zionism breaks. And the humanist side is kind of similar, but not because God wants it like that, but because the sociological reality of not having power makes you develop very high moral standards. And that is important for the world, right? They both come from the same place. And they both, of course, are upset at Zionism because Zionism said, that's all BS. Like, that's all like basically rationalizing our own oppression. Like, it's not that we choose not to have power, it's that we were deprived of power. And that's what I said, well, there's nothing unique about Jews, meaning it's simply that because of our historical circumstances, we didn't have power. And therefore, there's all these justifications and this trying to make lemonade with the lemons of history, right? But the Zionism calls the bluff. It says, guys, like, that's all bullshit. Like, at the end of the day, and Bialik even mocks, Bialik is a famous Zionist poet and writer, one of the greatest poets, Jewish poets of all time. He becomes a Zionist after the Kishinev pogrom, and he mocks that powerlessness of the Jews. He says, oh, you were there hiding like rats. That's what he says, hiding like rats, where your women were being ravished and your children were being killed, and you were hiding like rats. And these are the proud Jews, the descendant of the Maccabees. Like, it's like he was trying to shock people into action, but telling guys, this business of not having power is not a good idea. Look what is happening to us. So Zionism calls that bluff, and says, no, listen, we need to have, but there's something else that Zionism does. Zionism also challenges the notion that Jews produce the best when they don't have power. In other words, what the humanist progressives of the 19th and 20th century said is the Jewish genius depends on this condition of being an outsider. And again, I was mentioning before, Einstein and Kafka and Freud and Mendelssohn, all these people, why did we produce such geniuses? It's because we don't have power, we're outside of history, we need to have a very keen understanding of society because our life depends on understanding society very well. And also by looking at society from the outside, we can see things that folks that are in the middle can't see. So in a way, they say the best of Judaism gets produced in exile. And that's something that you hear till this very day. We produce our best when you're oppressed. That's also bullshit. And the ones who, if we got into the philosophical rabbit hole, the early Zionist thinkers were all influenced by what they call the German idealism and the national liberation movement of the Central European empires. Like, as opposed to many progressives claims today that Zionism is a settler colony ideology, they're plain ignorant. That's not the case. Zionism intellectually descends of Hegel and Herder on the one hand, on the German idealist, and it's modeled on the national liberation movements where peoples in Europe, in Central Europe, were trying to revolt against the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. And what German idealists say is this: a people can only develop fully in conditions of independence, sovereignty, and freedom, right? Hegel talks about the Volksgeist, the spirit of the people, that is something that the people contributes to the world, to the Weltgeist, as he calls it. So he says, he says the way for a people, for any nation, to develop its Volksgeist, its unique spirit, is to have conditions of sovereignty, power, independence, where it can actually develop. And then it can contribute to humanity, which is the opposite of what traditional of humanist thinking would say, right? And that is true actually, because you see that as much Nobel Prizes were produced outside of Israel, we produce as many in Israel, right? Like, in other words, it's not true that you have to have lack of power to produce your best. Hey, you can say that our best of all times was the Bible. And the Bible was produced in the land of Israel by a sovereign people in the land of Israel, right? You can say it was influenced by the Babylonian exile. True. The Jews will always be a global people and will always have this influence. But we could only write the Bible, which is a history of the Jews in their own land, in conditions of sovereignty. So it is not true that Jews produce their best under oppression.
Sure, it might be, and I don't think I agree with this, but it just dawned on me. Much of Israel's genius has also come out of necessity. I mean, it's obviously no surprise the sort of military to innovation pipeline in Israel. Israel. We're talking now in a week where it's sort of unclear. As of
Yeah,
now,
yeah,
I
yeah,
guess
yeah.
there's a ceasefire in place with Israel and Iran. I'm sure by the time people are listening to this, maybe it ended. Maybe but still the threat isn't gone, and so that is forcing some sort of genius. And one of it really is this catch-22. I'll make this, I guess, very personal. My wife and I just had a baby girl a couple of months ago, and I've been thinking about, I don't know, how to give children experiences that they'll grow up to be strong. And I remember I did a lot of stupid things when I was in elementary school and middle school and high school, and dangerous things. I'm a big outdoor person. I'm a big rock climber. I was a big surfer. Many situations where, I'll excuse if my parents end up listening to this, I'll tell them to close their ears for a bit. But, many situations where my life was at risk, and I, bit off way more than I can chew in nature. And, I think that I am a much stronger and better person because of those experiences. Yet I could never, in good faith, say, I really hope my 11-year-old daughter one day, embarks and finds herself in the middle of a cliff and her rope runs out, so she has to, whatever crazy scenario that I've been in. But then again, we obviously know that if you raise a child so sheltered as to never have any challenges, then they basically can't function in the world. And so there
Yeah.
is a little bit of those dynamics. I
Yeah, but
think
that's,
all, yeah,
yeah, right. So there's always that. But I mean, everybody will produce more under stress. At least I will. I mean, I write better on a deadline, if not, I'll procrastinate. But, and yes, uh, Israel is a lot of the creativity and genius of Israel is because of being under stress. Having power does not mean that you have no stressors. Like Israel, if you look at the geography of Israel, Israel was designed as a country to be in permanent tension. It's a small sliver of land, the sea to one side, the desert to the other, you know, a passageway between the big empires of the past. Israel was always destined to be a country in peril. Like the geography, there's a geographic determinism here of Israel was always going to be fragile and the Jewish people were always going to be vulnerable. So that's, yes, you're right. Vulnerability generates creativity, and you will not eliminate creativity but having Zionism, but you're going to have agency. So that's really one of my points, that in fact, these people that say that are anti-Zionist because they say, oh, look what power is doing to us, they're really cowards, because there's no moral dilemma when you have no power. Like, if I can't hit you, right, because I can't, I don't have the strength. So me not hitting you is not a moral achievement. I can't. So it's not a moral dilemma here. The real arena for moral dilemmas is when you have the power to do it, right? When you have the power to do something and you don't do it. When you, like, it's very easy, it's very facile to be in the diaspora and talk about a model society as instructed by the Talmud when you don't actually have to implement it, right? So these anti-Zionists, what they're so afraid of losing their own moral supremacy by testing it in the real world that they just prefer not to have any power.
Yeah, no, that's certainly, I think, going way off the deep end. Where I might try to, stake a claim, and I say this as, a
Yeah.
very proud Zionist on sort of all the levels, political Zionism. You were describing sort of a Chada Am's type of cultural Zionism before, about a people developing its own land. I am on board with all of that. This did come, early on in the Zionist movement, early 20th century, and then also once the national curriculum in Israel was built, with sort of an implicit, or at times actually explicit, sort of cutting out of that entire diasporic tradition. Meaning it's not a big leap from saying, well, with powerlessness comes no real moral squabbles or questions, so therefore the only thing that's really important is we're going to study the
Right.
Tanakh and we're going to study the
Yeah.
Hashmonite
And
dynasty,
that
and then
was, yeah, and that was a mistake. And that was the same mistake that, whatever, that was the same choice that the Talmud made that we then reverted, which is to become allergic to power and then discourage it. Now, the counterpart of it is the Zionist doctrine that it's called Shlilat HaGola, the denial of the diaspora. And that sort of claims that diasporic history was no history at all. And there's an amazing story, a short story by Chaim Azaz. It's called Hadrasha, the sermon. That is a kid in a kibbutz that stands up and makes his bar mitzvah story. And it's about Jewish history. And I said, I hate Jewish history. There's no such a thing as Jewish history. Jewish history ended in the year 70 when we lost sovereignty, and we regained it in 1948. And in the meantime, there is just darkness. That was prevalent in Israel in the 50s and 60s. It's now not embraced by virtually anybody in Israel. The Israelis outgrew that view, and Zionists outgrew that view. I went to a very Zionist school. We would learn Tanakh. We wouldn't learn Talmud, because the Tanakh is the story of a people in its land, and and the Talmud is exile. So
yeah,
that
no, because
was,
I have to say, I'm sorry to cut you off. It's funny because I've been involved in Zionist schools, camps,
yeah,
youth programs my whole life, and so I've never I actually wrote an op-ed the day George Steiner died, who you mentioned before, but I'll
yeah,
just talk about a little bit. He was sort of a great 20th century literary critic, Jewish, fierce critic of Zionism, but not really for any of the it's not that he was specifically talking about any specific thing, right? He wasn't against, quote unquote, the occupation or treatment of Palestinians. He was sort of the epitome of this argument where he talks about how,
right.
really the homeland of the Jewish people is within our intellectual tradition and not, any material ground. And then even more so, he says, with the Jewish tradition being sort of landlocked within this, geographical land, then by definition, this text is going to be, almost, he uses the metaphor of the Dead Sea Scrolls that are housed in Jerusalem, where, they're sort of
Yeah.
under bulletproof glass and bomb-proof glass and all of this, where he says, you could either have an alive intellectual tradition or you can have a homeland. You can't have both. That's probably an oversimplification, but what I wrote in this sort of op-ed was that out of all the criticisms of Zionism that I've heard, and I've essentially lived on a campus between undergrad, grad school, and now working on a campus for almost 15 years. So I've heard, every argument from the right, the left, religious, not religious, against Zionism I've heard, and almost none of them have given me any pause except for Steiner's argument. Not that I, am at risk
Yeah,
of
yeah.
going against
And
the
the reason,
tradition.
and
Yeah.
yeah, and the same to me, because Steiner is not Peter Beiner, meaning Steiner, he's not anti-Israel. That's his genius. He's not saying what Israel is doing to the Palestinians is wrong. Steiner says Israel is doing what any other nation with power does. It tries to vanquish its enemies and guarantee the survival of its people, and it needs an army. And when you run an economy, there are very real trade-offs that you need to make. So you can't be 100% fair and just, because that's not the way economies work. And so Steiner doesn't say Israel is whatever. No, Israel is a nation. It's a nation with power, and therefore, and such is and that's the way it behaves. And for him, and he even recognizes the need. He says in one of his last speeches, probably he says, Israel is the only place that will take me or my children or my grandchildren if there's any. So he acknowledges all that, but he says, isn't there a trade-off by, as you say, circumscribing Judaism or bringing back Judaism to its territorial dimension instead of its spiritual and cultural dimension, right? So he lays down the trade-off that you do when you do that. Now, what Steiner misses, though, is that Zionism never thought that the Jewish state will be like Albania, will be like just another country without relation to the world. Every Zionist thinker, even Jabotinsky, even the revisionist ones, thought of a Jewish state as the beginning of the road, not the end of the road. In other words, the Jewish state was going to be, or the achievement of political power was going to be not an end in and of itself, but a means to give the Jews the platform to develop fully as a people. Again, remember what Hegel said, right? It's Hegelian, is you need that platform to develop as a people, right? So that's what virtually all the Zionist thinkers thought. When Herzl writes, everybody knows the Jewish state, Herzl's, major book, but the Jewish state is a pamphlet. It's not really an ideological book.
Listen, I tried assigning it in one of my classes, and the students disagreed with you. They said you assigned a whole book. So
yeah, it's really short, but it's not just that. It doesn't include any ideological or philosophical innovation. Basically, what Herzl writes in the Jewish state, Pinsker had already written, and even Moses Hess had already written. So, but the true innovation of Herzl is in his second book, Alt Neuland. In Alt Neuland, Herzl brings up the character of the Jewish state, how he imagines it. He calls it the new society, and it's this utopic place, right? And it's clear that for him, having a state is not enough, right? The state has to be a model of, for example, of progressive social policies. He's like Alt Neuland, by the way, written in 1902, when no country in the world had votes for women. In Herzl's book, Alt Neuland in the Jewish state, of course women vote. And of course the Arabs have equal rights. And of course the workday is 7 hours, not even 8, 7 hours. So there was always, that's it. For Hadam, who's anti-Herzl, but even he says that the Jewish state is there to be the cultural center of the Jewish people. Like he talks about cultural Zionism. Virtually every Jewish thinker thinks that the state needs to serve a larger purpose. So going back to the anti-Zionist of today, like that, it's their attitude is lazy and cowardly, right? Because it's much easier to sit in an air-conditioned room in Columbia where you have tenure and lecture Israel about morality than actually, taking your sleeves up and go and work to create the country that you dream of.
yeah, was it Golda Meir who said, "I'd rather offer apologies than be offered condolences"? Or there was some.
Yeah, but that's okay. But that's a different. That's true. But that's that's a minimalistic view. We want to survive, and if we survive, we have to do things that we. Yes, fine.
Sure. No, but I think
but the notion that if you're like, listen, Peter Beinart, if you don't like Israel, don't take the easy way out, which is to say, well, I'm an anti-Zionist then. Go and shape the country in a way that it reflects your values. No, so I'm sitting up in my room in whatever university, and I lecture the world about that. I mean, it's lazy, right?
Yeah,
It's
no,
lazy and it's
there is a
facile and
mirror reflection in, maybe not quite one to one, but in a lot of, far left, or even Marxist thought, within, a lot of Marxist, political activism, there is a hesitancy to, achieve small victories because within, Marxist theology, the great uprising only comes when things hit a certain low threshold that then triggers in the great revolution. And so you don't actually want to raise the average life of people from maybe, I don't know, a 4 to a 5 on some arbitrary scale, because that's actually hurting your chances of ushering in the
absolutely.
great Marxist revolution. And it's
Which
sort of
is
the same thing. It's completely
It's
lazy
incident.
thinking.
It's a great example because it's this all or nothing mentality. Everything like these people are gonna tell you, oh, the fact that you're giving equal rights to Arabs, it's masking the colonial nature of your nationalist project.
Sure.
Well,
I mean, you also see this in
but
even in American politics. I mean, you see
yeah,
this
or
where,
where you say that, what you see that a lot is in radical feminism, which they would oppose things like equal pay, for example. They literally oppose equal pay because they say, well, equal pay actually still reinforces the patriarchy because you're just giving women something, but in fact, you're not dismantling the structures of patriarchal oppression, whatever that means. In Zionism, it's the same. Like, oh, Israel is this, Israel is that, but in fact, you're not dismantling the colonial project. Yeah, but by doing that, you're actually sacrificing people. Like, I was I'm the son of a single mother. You know, I, if you ask me what I preferred, whether sacrifice my own, my mom's salary to the dismantling of the patriarchal structures of power, or she getting the salary she deserves, I take I take the second one, give pay her more, because she and me and my brother depend on that for a living. We're not props. Like anti-Zionists try to make Jews into props in some universal morality tale, right? Like we're here, Jews are here to show some universal moral values. No, Jews are here to live fulfilled lives as full human beings. And belonging to a nation, having a nationality, having a state is part of living a fully and fulfilled human life. And incidentally, one of the things that the anti-Zionists miss is that by the very logic of Zionism, you have to also give national rights to the Palestinians. That's the biggest thing that they miss. Because they could say, yes, we accept the Zionist framework. And yes, Jews need their space to develop their Volksgeist and etc. And in Hegelian terms or in whatever terms you want, it's the right thing to do. In the same token, you're just provided the justification for Palestinian statehood. I'm totally okay with it. I'm a two-stater. I think that my Zionism makes me understand the Palestinian yearning for nationhood. I mean, you can argue how historically accurate is the term Palestinian people. That's all. It doesn't really matter because the Palestinians are here and they see themselves as a people. So whether they've been a people or they haven't been, now it's irrelevant. That they're here. They're here. They are a people. The moment they have that conversation was in 1920, not now. The same way, the moment they have the conversation about Zionism was also in 1920, not now. Like all these people that tell you, oh, I can't be an anti-Semite if I'm an anti-Zionist, because in the 1920s they were anti-Zionists. Yeah, and in the 1500, there were people who believed that the Earth was at the center of the universe. That doesn't prove anything.
Yeah, well, I also bring up the example, it's one thing to make the decision to not have children. It's another to kill them when they're 4.
Correct.
It's,
Correct.
and so
Correct. Yeah.
yeah,
If you,
it is one of my favorite chapters. I mean,
whether Zionism was a mistake or not, which I don't think it was, but whether it's an irrelevant conversation to have now, because the state of Israel exists and exists regardless of what some high-minded, self-important intellectual in Brooklyn says. By the way, I
sure.
live in Brooklyn too, so nothing
Oh,
against.
okay, there we go. So no, I mean
But you know what I mean? Like the state exists. So your decision is not anymore whether the state will exist or not, whether Zionism is a valid ideology or not. Zionism exists. It fulfilled its main core objective. So you're like arguing stuff that is irrelevant. You want to be relevant? Go and fight and argue for the character of the state.
Yeah, the one last thing I'll say, and then I do want to
Yeah.
spend 2 minutes because I know you just wrote a book, and I wanted to be able to discuss that in the last couple of minutes. Is that from some perspective, it's even a little bit sad that the anti-Zionists almost miss the entire point of what we're talking about. And I actually really hope that people who are listening, I hope specifically anti-Zionists to this, because what you're losing is you're not just, within this, idealistic world that's not a real world and not talking about the people effect, but I would argue even from your own stated goals, you're losing the chance to add your voice to the conversation. I think it was
Correct.
really interesting what you said about people like Peter Beinart. He's effectively, because I read his book, Crisis of Zionism, when it came out. It must have been, 10 or 15 years ago. And that's when he was still a Zionist. He was a two-stater. He was a little bit too liberal for my comfort. But I read it and I engaged with it, and probably seeped into my how I thought about he was talking then about Gaza, but this was again 15 years ago. Once he wrote his infamous Yavne essay where he essentially said, "I'm no longer a Zionist." People can squibble with this. I'm just talking about my own personal psychology. I essentially just stopped caring what he had to
Right,
say
but
because
it's right.
essentially
It's right
he's just not playing the game, and not that it's a
right.
game,
But
but
let me give you. I think you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, because it becomes a futile conversation. Here, and I had this conversation with Peter one-on-one, so I don't want to. And I'm actually, we're picking on him on a personal level. He's a very good guy. We're picking on him as a symbol of a thing. I don't want to just come across as, but I had this conversation with him. I said, imagine there's a patient on the table, right? And there's and there are different doctors around the table, right? And we argue on the diagnosis. We argue about what's the right type of surgery the patient needs. We argue about what's the prognosis. We argue about everything, but we all have something in common. We want the patient to survive. We want the patient to live, right? Here you come and you say, I don't want the patient to live. I don't care if the patient dies. Actually, it'll be better if the patient dies. So I can't have a conversation with you. Like that's not, it's a futile conversation because you're starting from a premise that is unacceptable to me and that is futile because the patient wants to live and is going to live anyways, right? Whether regardless you want it or not. So I think that you're absolutely right. By the anti-Zionists, they're actually taking themselves out of the conversation because because they make the conversation futile. Like it's not interesting for me to talk with somebody that says that Israel shouldn't exist because, first of all, because I can never agree with that, and secondly, because it's not going to change anything. Israel exists whether Peter Beinart wants or not.
Yeah,
So
we've had a couple. I mean, I'll just talk about the campus level, just for a minute, and then I do want to talk about your book for at least a couple of minutes. Uh, it's no surprise. I mean, this is also a minority of a minority. I think the reporting is way over reporting the number of young Jews who are becoming anti-Zionists, but it obviously is happening in some capacity. Some young Jews on campuses, and obviously Hillel is.
What happens is that just there's a problem there with terminology. Like I just met this is a young man who just went to school with my son and he says, I'm not a Zionist anymore. I said, what does that mean? You think the Jews shouldn't have a state? Of course should have a state. What are you talking about? He said, you're not a Zionist. I meant that I disagree with Netanyahu. Oh, okay, so I disagree with Netanyahu too. So, there's a lot of terminology there. There's something that, apropos colonization, the language has been colonized. And Zionism was meant, as to mean things that are not. So that's a caveat that is important. So when you see all these surveys, oh, young Jews are becoming anti-Zionist. By anti-Zionist, they may mean something very different than what you and I are talking about here.
Sure, 100%. And I think that's a very important point for, just whenever people look at survey data, this might upset people. I don't really trust survey data at all because I've been involved in administering survey data before. So, at least very general survey data is, my skepticism bells ring. That's probably another podcast to figure out with some social scientists. But I will say, I always, the pitch I make to students and the ones who have taken me up on this, it's actually been very successful. The ones who feel like they want to remove themselves from Jewish community because they disagree with the centrality of Israel or Zionism, whether they're right or wrong. I obviously think they're wrong. I work for, these quote unquote Jewish organizations, but I essentially make this exact pitch to them. I say, if you become one of those, I'm never going to go to Hillel because Hillel is, supporting, all this mumbo jumbo, neo-colonialist genocide, blah, blah, blah. And you stand there with a sign, you essentially have no say in the Jewish community. And if anything, you're probably going to harden the Jewish community because it's just going to go into our, okay, not just are all these other people against us, they're even trying to co-opt a smaller percentage of Jews, the same way that happened in, the medieval church where they would always get,
Yeah.
5% of Jews to convert, and they would be sort of the some of the worst Jewish oppressors in medieval ages were Jews who converted to Christianity. What I tell them is, hey, listen, I'm a very, open person, open-minded person. I always have open conversations, not just on campus, at Shabbat dinners, every week at Hillel, we have, maybe not to this quite level, and there's a lot more memes that are a part of it when I'm talking with college students. But, I try to have a lot of these conversations and I tell them, if you don't show up to Jewish community, then no one's ever going to hear that voice, which is probably an important voice to some extent. And it has worked with some people and actually drawing them back to the Jewish community because I think, with a strong Jewish community and also strong Zionism, that can absorb strong criticisms of Zionism, not outright anti-Zionism, right? I don't think Zionism needs to absorb anti-Zionism, right? Because that gets everything to what we were talking about before. But part of Zionism helping the Jewish people actualize means we need both the cheerleaders and also people, as we've had for 2,000 years of our tradition, rabbis and, scholars and thinkers giving us musar of saying, actually, this is not the ideal way to do things. And so I think, if you are somebody who's listening to this and you're anti-Zionist and you've somehow made it through the full hour without ripping your hair out completely, I would implore you to, try to actually do this and, attach yourself to Jewish community and show up and engage people in conversation. And I think a lot of those types, and, or I'll speak to first person, I think you will be surprised at how open the Jewish community is to hearing these conversations once you sort of enter the arena of, okay, we're all on board with this project. What should it look like? That's a very different community than when I have to existentially protect my project from someone trying to destroy it.
My project and my life. Like when you're talking about Israel shouldn't exist, you're talking about a life threat to 10 million people. 8 million Jews and 2 million Arabs. Like it's not talking here, but like that's the other thing, right? Like what is more colonialistic than sitting in comfort in Brooklyn or San Francisco and telling the indigenous peoples, both Israelis and Palestinians, what they should do. Like when you don't have skin in the game. Like people tell me, oh, in Israel people criticize. Yes, of course. But in Israel, at least, you have skin in the game. I have to tell you, for me, it's way, way easier to discuss or to argue, even to fight with Palestinians than with Western progressives. Because again, back to the idea of the patient on the table, right? The Palestinian and we both want the patient to live. The patient being our two peoples, and we both have skin in the game. Like when some white guilt, progressive in Brooklyn lectures me about what Israel should do from the comfort of, from the privilege of of the United States, I mean, I feel like you don't have any moral standing to do that because you don't have skin in the game, because you're privileged, because you're dictating to two indigenous people how they need to solve their problems. Like this is actually colonialism in another guise, right? Like it's like old colonialism was trying to civilize the savages. Now colonialism means telling the savages how they should behave. Like it's the same basically. Anyway,
Yeah. So anyway, just in the last couple of minutes, I know you wrote a book about sort of where does Judaism move on from here, but can you
yeah.
give sort of the general thesis? We can whet people's appetite. Should they want to go find it.
Yes, great. The book is called Tradition and Transition: The Jewish Community and the Hyper-Empowered Individual. It actually touches on some of the issues we discussed. Basically, the main argument of the book is this: the human being has changed a lot in the last 300 years, but especially in the last 50 years. And the human being has become hyper empowered. The human being wants to make their own decisions. They have more agency and more freedom of choice than ever in the history of the human race. We have technological tools that allows us, that empowers us, but we are hyper empowered because we really have a lot of control over our lives, right? And it touches not only on what we do or how we work or where we live, but also how we define our own identity, how we build our own identity. We were talking in the ancient times, 300 years ago, nobody had to think what their identity was. Their identity was given by the collective group to which they belong, right? Very few people traveled, very few people moved, very few people changed religion. Yeah, there was always deviants and people who, but by and large, the meaning of your life, so to speak, was your role in the society. That's all. You didn't have any choice in the matter, but you also didn't have the need to build it yourself. In the 21st century, that is upside down. You are forced to build your own identity, and you're forced to make choices at every step of the way. We have a complete universe of free choice, and our choice keep expanding and expanding. That, of course, is going to change Jewish life because are Jewish organizations ready or prepared or built in a way in which individuals can exercise free choice? Do they give agency to individual Jews to build their own identity, or they tell them this is the identity, it works? Right? So my main point is that, or my main argument, let's say, is that the hyper empowerment of the human being in the 21st century is creating three crises in the Jewish world: a crisis of meaning, a crisis of belonging, and a crisis of structures, of organizational structures. And my argument is not, of course, to turn back the clock. We can't. But to say, what does the Jewish community need to do in order to respond better to this new individual, to this new Jewish individual? So that's the book
It's
in a
really interesting.
nutshell.
No, I was going to say, on the last day of my, or second to last day of my Jewish law class, after, we talked about the entire history of Jewish law, and then obviously a lot of what we were talking about in the 18 and 1900s, not specifically with a focus on Zionism, but through the lens of, how law and halacha and, Judaism, went through all this, in infraction points. And we had this, I asked this question: do you think Jewish community can survive without any sense of, legal obligation or halachic obligation? And we actually had a pretty big bell curve of people in the class, of some people who said, I don't see how Judaism really survives, to other people say, no, of course it will. And so, it seems like that's exactly what your book is touching on. Andres, I really appreciate the conversation. Thank you so much. If you have any, last minute thoughts, feel free. I will give you the final word.
No, but a big pleasure to be with you, Daniel, and to have these conversations. And just my last word to your listeners is just don't be afraid of having these conversations that are important, especially for the young folks that are listening. Discover the joy of being part of something, of building something. Don't succumb to the temptation of criticize stuff from the sides of the road. Come inside. We all have issues with the way Israel is and the way Israel looks. But for good or for bad, Zionism gave us the only collective project of the Jewish people. It's the only collective project we have. So it's going to define you whether you want it or not. So come in, try to shape it, try to influence it, and discover the joy of participating in that project.
Amazing. Well, thank you again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.